I'd like to welcome you all to the second in our series of events on divergence in environmental policy. And today we're looking particularly at EU and UK biodiversity targets. These are targets being developed, not adopted at this particular point, and covering a wide suite of biodiversity issues, including habitats and species in varying degrees. And today, our objective is to get a sense of where biodiversity targets are going in the 4 different parts of the UK, and to compare them with the parallel process in the EU, where the Commission has put forward quite a comprehensive proposition, which includes a variety of targets in that. So coming up to the big COP for the Convention on Biodiversity in Montreal in December, where countries around the world are thinking about where their biodiversity commitments are going, how they're going to be developed in the next few years, how we're going to address the sort of global crisis in biodiversity. It's particularly apt time to be thinking about the role of targets, how these are being developed, what the differences are. And we start, I think, from no particular assumption that targets should be the same, either in the 4 parts of the UK or between the UK and the EU. But it's difficult not to see the partners in this sort of 5-part arena as benchmarks for one another. In the UK, we will be looking at the EU and vice versa. And inside the UK, we'll be looking at the 4 countries and how they differ, what the advantages are, whether we are finding ways of doing things better, more imaginatively, and also how they can join up and work in a constructive way together. So this is not a sort of competition, but it is, I think, helpful to be analytical, to be clear. And because the UK and the EU have had the same standards, the same targets pretty much for quite a few decades now, it is significant once they begin to diverge. And it's important for stakeholders, for people to understand what the implications of that are. And of course, it's not that easy anymore to follow what's happening in the 4 countries of the UK and to be able to see them all side by side. It's become, it requires a certain amount of digging around and to compare those with the EU. So we're very lucky today to have speakers from each of the 4 countries, each expert in their own field, and to have an overview of the EU side and a comparison of the EU with the 4 countries from Graham Tucker, and I'll introduce the speakers in a minute. The programme today is essentially, we start with Graham giving us an overview of his report, and then we'll have speakers from each of the 4 countries, one after the other, and sort of without having immediate questions after that. And that'll be then followed by an opportunity to respond, to react, to correct us if we find some misunderstandings in there, and then to have a debate as to the significance or otherwise of what we've heard and where we should be going. So it'll be a first period of presentations, then a period of sort of questioning and debate, and then we will end on time. I think speakers are happy that slides will be shared afterwards, so there will be access for people who want to the presentations. And we'd welcome people's questions. Put your hands up or use the Q&A function, and of course do use the chat function as well. And it's always interesting to see people's thoughts, reactions, cross references to other sources and other things that are going on. So do feel able to do that. And we have a good selection of people from all across the UK coming, and thanks everybody for signing up and registering. So I hope we'll get a fair reflection of what's going on in each of the different jurisdictions, and that we'll get sort of comments back from each of those countries. Finally, IEP, I should say, is Institute for European Environmental Policy, for people who are not familiar with that. It's a think tank based in Brussels and in London, and we have a UK program which we're expanding a bit, have a bit more capacity in the UK, and this is part of that work, where we are thinking about divergence and exploring what it means, how to track it, what its consequences are. So this is the second webinar, and we will be holding more on different environmental topics. Good. So without further ado, I'm now going to introduce our first speaker, who is Dr. Graham Tucker. He's a long-term expert on biodiversity policy in the UK and in Europe, and has written several quite impressive tomes on the subject, and has had some involvement in work inside the Commission in the development of the nature targets that have been being put in place in the past and are being thought about at the moment. And he's an IEP associate. So Graham, over to you.
Thank you, David, very much indeed, and good afternoon, everybody. If we could move on to the first slide. The report is mainly based on published information, documents and political statements, etc. But I must say that I've also had extremely useful material provided from several of the other contributors to this webinar, and I thank them very much for that. There's also an opportunity for those of you who've registered the webinar. You should have received the report to provide comments yourselves, and those are very welcome, please, up until the end of next week, which is 30th September. So move on to the first slide, or the next slide. Yeah, this summarizes the headline biodiversity target and key initiatives. And central to this and the EU's biodiversity strategy, and particularly of relevance here, is the proposal for a regulation on nature restoration with mandatory restoration targets for member states. Its strongest measures focus on the protected habitats and species of high conservation importance, as listed in the Habitats Directive, as well as additional marine habitats and all wild native bird species in accordance with the Birds Directive. For each EU protected habitat, restoration is required in each country wherever it is necessary to achieve the habitat's favourable conservation status, which includes the habitat requirements of the characteristic species. There are also complementary targets for improving key indicators of the general ecological condition of forests, agricultural habitats and urban areas. Therefore, importantly, the targets form quite a coherent set. Overall, it is foreseen that restoration will cover at least 20% of the EU by 2030. To move on to the next slide, these very quickly summarise the current situation within the UK, and we'll hear more about Northern Ireland shortly. It is difficult to compare the headline targets that we have at the moment in the EU and the proposals in England and Northern Ireland in terms of divergence and ambition, as they are all rather broad, unquantified and ambiguous, especially regarding their long-term aims. However, we can say that very broadly, they are similar in all, aiming to halt the decline and loss of biodiversity by 2030. It's not currently, unfortunately, possible to reliably or assess the actual divergence within the UK, as the proposals made so far for England and Northern Ireland may change as a result of consultation responses so far. Whilst the governments of Scotland and Wales have committed to developing biodiversity targets, consultations on them are ongoing. Therefore, the rest of my presentation will therefore focus on just the EU, England and Northern Ireland, and comparing them. So if we move on to the next slide, yes, thank you. Notwithstanding the current uncertainties and possible future changes, it is apparent that the published proposals in England and Northern Ireland show some similarities, for example, in terms of wildlife-rich habitat restoration and woodland coverage, but also potentially significant divergence. Most notably, the targets in England will include legally binding targets in accordance with the 2021 Environment Act. It's not a requirement in Ireland, and no legally binding biodiversity targets were proposed in the draft Environment Strategy. Although the draft strategy does include commitment to legislate for some global targets, such as on protected areas, it is not clear whether or when this will actually happen and be implemented. Anyway, the situation in Northern Ireland will be discussed further in the presentation by Jane Clark. So moving on to the situation in the EU, the proposed habitat restoration targets for England and Northern Ireland cover a wide range of so-called wildlife-rich habitats, which are very broadly defined. Now, these include priority habitats, many of which are EU protected habitats. And these are the focus of the proposals in Northern Ireland. The focus on priority habitats was also importantly an intention in the 25-year environment plan for England, but it's no longer the case in the proposals. Unfortunately, the reasons for this are not given by DEFRA. Furthermore, DEFRA has proposed widening the definition of wildlife-rich habitats, for example, including a variety of hedges, grasslands, and broadleaf woodlands. And although these can be wildlife-rich, in practice, they are not wildlife-rich as most people would consider them to be. Furthermore, modelling by DEFRA indicates that such lower biodiversity value habitats, including arable field margins, would probably make up the bulk of the envisaged restoration to meet the target. In contrast, in the EU, in recognition of the high conservation importance and generally poor condition, the strongest restoration measures focus on EU protected habitats. And as mentioned earlier, to complement them, the proposed restoration law also has more general targets for forests, agricultural ecosystems, and urban areas, which are based on key quality indicators. The EU has also set up mandatory targets to recreate depleted habitats to ensure that they achieve minimum viable areas. These and other targets for particular habitats are lacking in the UK, other than for general tree cover, and in Northern Ireland there is a target for peatlands. This is surprising given that many habitats have declined in area so much in the UK, and one could, for example, think there would be a high priority for restoring some of the most fragmented habitats, such as, for example, lowland semi-natural grasslands or heathlands. So to move on to the next slide and consider species. This only relates to England because only targets of species have so far been made for England. Now, the 2021 Environment Act certainly does set a legal precedent and is world leading in terms of its idea of setting a species target. Well, it's a requirement rather than an idea. However, to be meaningful, the target needs to be ambitious, and it certainly needs to address the most important species conservation priorities. The current proposals are to halt declines in species abundance by 2030 and increase them by 10% by 2042. And there is a complementary target to reduce the extinction risk of species based on a red list index of extinction risk at a GB level. Now, these targets are considered to be unambitious by some NGOs, although the DEFRA modelling does suggest they would be challenging, particularly to 2030. But they certainly do not give a strong incentive for the most important conservation measures. And the reason for this is that the abundance target is only based on a single combined index of the representative species, where all are treated equally, whether or not they are declining or benefiting from human degradation of the environment. So declines in some species that we're particularly concerned about could be offset or balanced by undesirable increases in others. Now, whilst the index is useful, and it certainly should be kept, there should be complementary targets for species of particularly high conservation concern. No explanation is given in the proposals as to why there are no other targets. This is very odd, especially because suitable indicators already exist, such as for priority species and farmland birds and a number of other species groups. Now, DEFRA does recognise the need to take concerted action for threatened species, and therefore has included the Red List index-based target to complement the abundance target. But it only covers a relatively small set of species and is very insensitive. So it's not a replacement for the other complementary targets. Although the proposed restoration law targets for EU protected species are rather vague, there are also more defined and ambitious targets for particularly important groups. In particular, recognising the plight of farmland birds, which is similar in the UK to the EU has a specific target to increase their populations in the most depleted countries by 10% by 2030 and 5% in all other countries. And this is more ambitious than the England General Species Target. Ironically, the target that was set by the EU draws on BTO and RSPB research in England that shows that such a recovery is feasible with well-designed and well-targeted agri-environment schemes. So in conclusion, in the last slide, the most important conclusion probably is that whilst the requirement in England for a legally binding species abundance target is internationally leading, as currently defined, its level of ambition is questionable. And most importantly, due to its broad nature, the species and habitats targets in England and Northern Ireland could be achieved whilst major losses in biodiversity continue, such as in natural habitats and particularly threatened species groups. Overall, one can therefore say that the Brexit freedoms and resulting divergence have not so far led to proposed biodiversity targets that could be said to be truly world-leading, nor are they as comprehensive, coherent, or mostly as ambitious as those in the proposed EU restoration law. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You covered a lot of ground, and I think you shed light on each of the different targets very concisely. Thank you. We're now going to go to our first speaker from looking at the UK, and that is Richard Benwell, Chief Executive Wildlife Contract Link since 2019, and has been involved in many different organizations inside and outside government. And he's going to look at England for us. So welcome, Richard.
Thank you very much, David, and thanks, Graham, for a brilliant report, which I think is absolutely vital, as you say, using the 5 different jurisdictions as comparators, and hopefully creating a race to the top is exactly what we should be doing. So it's great to see IEEP in this space. It's also great that we have an Environment Act in England that sets requirements on the government to establish legally binding targets for air, water, waste and wildlife. That's a really positive step forward, and one that, as nature campaigners in England, we've been calling on for some time. I think we started campaigning for a nature bill to set legally binding targets for wildlife almost a decade ago. So it's brilliant that that's on the statute book now. You can feel the but coming. The but is that the key was always that those targets must be additional to targets that we already have in law in the UK as a result of our membership of the European Union and as a result of our ratifying international environmental law. So before diving into the Environment Act targets today, I just want to make the point that the bill that's been laid in Parliament today, the retained EU law revocation or reform bill, is one that poses a really important divergence risk between England and the EU, one that could undermine all of the potential good work that comes through the targets framework in the Environment Act. Because the Environment Act targets are there to fill gaps. They're there to add to the body of environmental targets that we've inherited through our membership of the EU and that exist largely in secondary legislation from the European Communities Act. So I'm thinking of things like the targets to achieve good status in the marine environment by 2020. I'm thinking of things like the Water Framework Directive target, which is in the Water Framework Regulations, to bring our freshwater bodies into good chemical and ecological status by 2027. I'm thinking of things like the targets under the Air Quality Directive, which now exist in secondary retained law in England. All of these are absolutely fundamental to biodiversity. We're never going to achieve our aims to restore wildlife unless we take a synergistic approach to tackling all environmental problems. That includes cleaning the freshwater environment. It includes dealing with things like chemical pollution and air pollution. And the bill that's been laid in Parliament today adds to a set of powers that the government has been accreting for itself that could weaken those really important baseline targets that we've had in law for a very long time through the Environment Act, through proposals in the Levelling Up Bill, and today in the EU Retained Law Bill, which will give the government a broad mandate to sunset retained law by end of 2023. So in other words, that those laws that exist on the statute book, unless they've been amended, clarified or reinstated, will cease to have effect at the end of 2023. And that could be a real divergence risk, because we know that the significant pressure on government to get rid of the peskier targets in there, like the Water Framework Directive targets, which have proven so difficult to meet and which we've heard wrongly are bad targets because they are composite targets. Instead of taking action to meet those targets, there's a real risk that we'll diverge by taking them away. So there is also, of course, a case to be made that there's no point having targets unless you have the machinery of government in place to meet them. And the other things that are put at risk by the announcements today and again tomorrow, with things like changes to nutrient neutrality under the Habitats Directive and things like the Habitats Regulations rules that threaten to be weakened in the new industrial enterprise zones. These are the laws that will give us a chance of actually meeting those targets. And so we face a real divergence risk there. The second sort of framing point I want to make is that there's also no point having targets unless you have the implementation mechanisms built around them, and there's still a lot of work to do around that in both in England and in the EU. So in particular, we've seen time and time again that it's quite easy to set long-term targets for the environment, but unless you actually manage to do the next stage of having attribution targets that divvy up effort needed to reach the targets, then you're not going to get the sorts of action on the ground that are needed to make a difference. So the next critical stage for the government in England will be to use the Environment Improvement Plan, which is another statutory requirement in the Environment Act, to actually say, well, what do we need to do to achieve the species target that Graham has mentioned? we need to attribute effort to those responsible polluting sectors to actually get on and create the habitat, invest in the species, cut the pollution that's needed to meet them. So it'll be really, really important in the environmental improvement plan to see well-evidenced, transparent and objectively justifiable policy scenarios that say, if we want to turn around the decline of species, that means that the water sector needs to take this effort. The retail sector needs to take this effort. The development sector needs to take this effort, so that you actually have a series of attribution targets for the effort needed to reach your long-term targets. And just very quickly, the third sort of structural point I'd make, of course, is that we're also waiting for interim targets as part of that environmental improvement plan. And once again, the experience of targets past has taught us that you need to be able to chart your pathway to success. And you need to be able to hold the government to account along the way to have any hope of not arriving at a target 25 years hence, realizing you've missed it and then setting another. So the pathways that are laid out as interim targets in the environmental improvement plan are another really important structural point we'll be looking for. Turning to the particulars of the targets under the Environment Act, it really is fantastic news that we're going to have a legally binding target to halt the decline of species abundance in England by 2030. And that was a significant campaigning win for many of the people on this call. So thank you again. And it was really good that the government, once it had been defeated in the House of Lords, listened to the case for a target and brought forward its own proposals to do that. That's fantastic. It is world leading and could make a really big difference. As Graham's already mentioned, the way that that target is constituted is going to be critical to its real world success. We hope that among the basket of 1,000 odd species that will be considered in the index, there will be a proper representation of those important groups of biodiversity that are needed to drive change. So farmland birds, pollinators, freshwater wildlife, all of those groups need to be represented and need to be on an upward trajectory if we're to succeed. Early indications are there could be significant gaps. For example, marine wildlife could be missed out completely. And what a tragedy it would be if we were to set a target to halt the decline of wildlife and completely forget what's going on under the sea. I understand there might be seabirds in there, but that's not really enough to tell us whether there's restoration at sea. And we'll hope that as part of the environmental improvement plan, some of those particular groups are pulled out for a focus on action. So it's absolutely critical, for example, that if we're going to succeed, action in the farmed environment is one of the main levers for success. The farmland bird indicator will be a really important way to keep track of whether that's working. The second big biodiversity target is this target to increase the index by 2042 by 10% compared with 2030. What a lovely thing it is to set a target on the basis of a baseline that we don't know yet. As Graham's already hinted in polite terms, the real world implications of that could be that there's actually less wildlife at the end of the target period than there is today, because we could be facing another 8 years of decline before the baseline is set, atop which that 10% will be added. Of course, it's a difficult thing to do, to be braver than that. It will require changes across government in every sector of the economy. But if the government has any truth and integrity behind the promise it made at the start of its time in office, that it would be the first government to pass on in nature in better condition, then surely that's got to be more than passing on nature in just about as good condition as it is a decade of decline further down the line. That target needs to be strengthened if that promise is to be held true. I won't continue much longer, David. I just want to point out one other gap, if I may. The one other gap is that the twin brother of species action is, of course, habitats action. And the two major problems with the habitat proposals from the government at the moment are the complete lack of a target for the condition of our protected site network. So that's our most important sites, SSSIs, SACs, SPAs. At the moment, the SSSI network is malingering somewhere below 40% in terms of its favourable condition. Originally, the 25-year plan said it would increase that to 75%, but that target has been dropped. Unless we're focusing on the quality of those protected sites, then the species objectives will never be achieved. That's a gap that should be filled. The government has said that's because it's updating the metric. That seems a very poor excuse for not setting an aspiration now, and if necessary, updating as we go. The second big gap is that extent and preferably condition of important habitat outside the protected area network. There is this promise of 500,000 hectares of wildlife-rich habitats. We hope that wildlife-rich measure will be a true one and won't include some of those areas of lower biodiversity value. But the real question that remains is whether that's going to be a net figure or a gross figure. I still don't have a clear answer about whether the 500,000 hectares will genuinely be additional in terms of area covered across England and take into account losses over time. It would be a hollow victory if we were to see 500,000 hectares of new habitat created while facing the destruction of large areas of mature and important priority habitat at the same time. There's lots more that could be said, particularly around water targets, waste targets, and the need to support biodiversity. There's a lot more to be said about the marine environment too, but I'll leave it there, if I may, with a point that let's not get rid of EU inherited targets because that's big divergence. Let's make sure that the framework is there with attribution and milestones, and let's beef up those biodiversity ambitions and match them with promises for habitat quality and improvements outside the protected area network. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Richard, and for giving us quite an overview and a bit of political setting at the same time. What we're going to do now is move on to Northern Ireland, and the presentation here is going to be from Dr. Jane Clark. She is the chair of the Northern Ireland Nature and Environmental Protection Working Group, works for SPB, and I'm sure she'll mention marine areas because her PhD was in marine spatial planning and climate change mitigation. Jane, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I know any excuse to talk about the marine environment, which, as Richard just says, frequently gets sort of lost in the sort of the discussion. Yes, hello everyone. Thank you very much to the Institute for European Environmental Policy for having me along today and to speak about this really important area, but also sort of initiating this work so that we can do that real critical assessment of comparing across the countries and obviously with the EU. So if you could move on to the next slide, please. So just by the way, a bit of context of Northern Ireland. So it's a beautiful country, but we're a beautiful country. It's facing a serious nature crisis. So recent research from the Natural History Museum and RSPB showed that we rank 12th worst in the world for the amount of biodiversity we have left. A lot of our species are at risk from extinction, and very few of our priority habitats are in good condition, and our water quality is non-existent. So in this sort of, image of crisis is also complicated by the geopolitical boundary between the north of Ireland and the south of Ireland, which, as we know, nature does not adhere to. So within this sort of this nature crisis, these sensitivities and these complications of a border, protected or biodiversity targets are being developed both in the north and in the south. And so if we move on to the next slide. So there are three sort of areas where we have to look in Northern Ireland to consider sort of what biodiversity targets are being set. And the first of those is the draft environment strategy, which has come out of the Environment Act. But Northern Ireland was included in the Environment Act at a time when we didn't have an assembly or an executive. And so the Environment Act for Northern Ireland is very much a framework bill. So while it does require an environmental improvement plan to be established for Northern Ireland, it doesn't have the legal obligations on targets or a number of other areas. Sorry, I seem to have disappeared. Sorry, my screen sort of froze for a second. So the draft environment strategy was consulted on at the start of this year, and it's quite a wide-ranging document. There's 6 strategic environmental outcome areas, and there are over 225 actions proposed. But within these, it's a case of the good, the bad, and the absent. So the good areas that we're seeing, which sort of contradicts England, is that we're seeing condition targets for protected areas, which we're incredibly supportive of. There's also commitments to habitat creation outside of protected areas and commitment to legislation. However, these positives are also balanced by negatives. So the bad things that we're noticing within this document are that there's a lack of specificity. There are many targets that don't have a time frame or just completely unmeasurable as well. And we're also seeing commitments that actually are below legally required targets, such as water quality. The other negative point about the strategy is that there's absent policies and there's absent targets. So as Graham noted, there's no species targets, but we're also not seeing every driver of biodiversity loss being dealt with. So no discussions or commitments on biosecurity or wildlife persecution. So the hope is that the final strategy will be much improved. However, the OEP today laid their first advice on the environment strategy, and they have responded to the finalised strategy. So the finalised strategy was approved by the Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs Minister in Northern Ireland just before the Assembly and Executive collapsed earlier this year. But it does paint a disappointing picture of this finalised strategy. There are still a large percentage of the commitments and proposals that are without time frame, lack of specificity. It's many of the things the NGO sector has been calling for and saying for quite a while. As you should all know, we obviously don't have a functioning political institution in Northern Ireland at the moment, but the way in which this strategy was commenced as part of the Environment Act means that sort of regardless of the political state or political context that we're sitting in, by 25th of July 2023, this strategy must be published. But obviously, we need to see this strategy much earlier, and we need to see implementation as soon as possible. Can you move on to the next slide, please? So the second place to look for biodiversity targets is quite an interesting one. It is Northern Ireland's first Climate Change Act that was given royal assent earlier this year. It sets a net zero target for 2050 with some exemptions for methane. But to achieve this net zero target, it requires climate action plans to be created. And as part of those climate action plans, targets for biodiversity and soil quality must be set. There is also an ambition to encourage the use of nature-based solution projects when achieving the sort of the net zero target, which is very, very good. Another benefit of this approach is that there's cross-departmental duties on these climate action plans, and also the requirement for cross-border collaboration as well as funding. So there's a just transition for agriculture, which we hope to see proposals for soon. However, there's a potential conflict between a biodiversity target for climate and a biodiversity target for nature's recovery. So the biodiversity targets that must be set under the Climate Change Act must be to achieve the net zero target. However, a tree planting target that doesn't take the right tree in the right place approach could be detrimental to breeding waders or peatland restoration. The other issue that we're facing is that we're 3 months into a 24-month timeline for these climate action plans and targets to be produced, and there's been little or no consultation or engagement. And whilst we appreciate that obviously there is a lack of functioning institutions, these discussions have to happen now, and ensuring that the targets are set in a way that it faces the nature and climate crisis together. Next slide, please. So the final place to look for biodiversity targets in Northern Ireland is our biodiversity strategy. So Northern Ireland, like the rest of the global community, are looking to Montreal in December this year for the CBD Convention on Biological Diversity to set the next global framework for biodiversity. And we will need to obviously translate those global asks into domestic action. However, the hopes and dreams of a biodiversity strategy in Northern Ireland are sort of tempered by past failings. Our previous strategy ran out in 2020, and over 83% of government targets and actions were missed. And going back to the start, we're in a nature crisis and nature is declining, so we need action. So a co-design process has been started, and there's still a lot to learn and a lot to develop between the department and the NGO sector and broader interests. But it's a good sign that sort of a more active approach is being taken. But again, we're seeing proposals coming forward that still lack ambition and specificity. Simple things such as timelines are not being committed to. So it's incredibly difficult to see where a target will land if there's no sort of measuring framework around it. We hope that a draft strategy will be consulted on shortly after CBD. But ultimately, again, these targets will not be legally binding. And it should be noted again that in the OEP's evidence or advice to DERA that was published today, they again reiterated the need for a legally binding framework for these targets. But as Richard said, these should not be seen as a sort of an opposition to targets that already exist. These should be complementary and fill in gaps, because there are still gaps within our targets system. Next slide, please. So when considering sort of the potential and the reality of divergence within the UK, it's important to consider sort of the fact that divergence in itself is not inherently bad. Divergence can mean upwards or downwards. And so divergence and the ability, the fact that the environment is a devolved matter means that countries can go on and go further and go faster without having to be brought along as a collective whole. However, in Northern Ireland, there's a real risk that without political institutions and political will, that we'll adopt the lowest common denominator approach, and that we'll take a system that's being developed elsewhere. And we're already seeing sort of indications of looking towards what England have done. And as Richard said, there are serious gaps and still inadequacies within those targets, and they will be adopted in Northern Ireland without considering how they will actually affect nature in our country. Obviously, divergence, as I suppose is normally discussed, is normally considered as a downward trend. So there's this race to the bottom to remove the sort of the burden, as is described, of targets and everything like that, which obviously is a real risk. Another risk that we're facing in terms of this divergence is the UK-wide or the centralised decisions. Just as the EU retained revocation and reform bill was discussed, we're also seeing risks in the levelling up and regeneration bill, where centralised decision is going to impact the achievement of targets within countries, as well as supposedly, the removal of these laws. And whilst that EU retained law bill is Westminster focused, from our understanding, there's about 650 pieces of environmental law that are impacting or will impact Northern Ireland. So with the risk of a sunset clause and no political institutions, we're facing a huge gap and a potential hole in our legal statute, which is incredibly worrying. Then there's also the risk of this divergence in our reporting to CBD. We are, of course, a single signatory. And so this sort of going off in different directions is problematic, because how do we report and how do we show that we are creating true change on the ground for nature? And ultimately, divergence creates uncertainty. Targets are obviously very, very good for creating on-the-ground net restoration, habitat creation, etc. But there will be a role for businesses and industry in achieving these targets. And this divergence, particularly race to the bottom, creates risk and creates uncertainty. Final slide, please. So divergence with the EU. Northern Ireland is incredibly unique in this sort of discussion, or this area, that we have a land border and a sea border with the European Union in the Republic of Ireland. And we have to remember that we're part of this single biogeographic unit. So actions in one area will inherently affect the actions in the other. But there's an opportunity here. As we've seen, the EU is coming forward with proposals for nature restoration as well as pesticide reduction. So there's the opportunity to use the targets and commitments set in one area as a ratcheting process, a ratcheting up of ambition on both sides of the border. But there's also then a risk that we'll have different ambitions and different measurements. And we're already seeing different percentage targets being set for the likes of pesticides, whether it's in the EU, where it's a 50% reduction target. In the north, we're seeing suggestions of 67% reduced of loss to the environment. So these nuances can make a real impact in that we're sort of trying to chase different goals and different targets. And if we're not acting collectively, again, we will not create the necessary change and the drive to effect change on that single biogeographic unit. But ultimately, also, the point about divergence not being necessarily always a bad thing is that following or diverging from the EU should not always be seen as the ceiling. Any ambitions set within the south or in the north should be seen as the floor, not the ceiling of potential, and that there's a need to go beyond and not just simply say, well, we must follow European systems, because it's that we must follow the highest level of ambition, and we need to set that in Northern Ireland and match it with action on the ground in collaboration with the South. And I think that is it. So thank you very much. And sorry, I think I went over my 12 minutes, but thank you very much.
Thanks, Jane. Yes, tight to get it all in. We're going to go now to Scotland, if we can, to Isabel Mercer, who's representing Scottish Environment Link, and also has an academic background in nature law, Brexit policy in Scotland. So welcome, Isabel.
Thanks, David, and good afternoon, everyone. And yeah, just reiterating the thanks to IEEP for the invitation to take part in this discussion, which feels kind of particularly timely given some of the things that Richard was talking about earlier. So I'm just going to give a quick rattle through the situation with nature targets here in Scotland. If we could go to the next slide, please. So it's worth just, I suppose, starting by saying that mirroring the global situation and similar to what Jane was just saying, while Scotland is a wonderful and renowned place to visit wildlife, Scotland's nature is in trouble. The State of Nature Scotland 2019 report found that on top of historical losses in biodiversity, nearly half of species in Scotland have declined since 1970, and 1 in 9 species is at risk of national extinction. So as we've been talking about elsewhere, the challenge here has really been about shifting that narrative from talking about halting the loss of biodiversity and safeguarding what we've got left to looking at this widespread, large-scale restoration and regeneration of nature. And what's really positive is that we have indeed begun to see this substantial shift reflected in the rhetoric and commitments from the Scottish Government over the last couple of years. So there's a few key moments on the screen here, but I'll just pick out one, which is that most notably in August last year, the Scottish Government and the Scottish Green Party established a cooperation agreement to work together in government for the next 5 years. And this was underpinned by something called the Butte House Agreement, which is basically a draft shared policy programme. And notably, this included a commitment to a natural environment bill, which will include binding nature restoration targets. And we're expecting that bill to be brought forward at the end of 2023 or the beginning of 2024. Next slide, please. So this commitment is obviously great news. It's been hugely welcomed by ENGOs. We're obviously at a slightly later stage than the countries we've just heard about. And so in terms of some of the detail, we're still waiting to see what these targets are really going to look like. But the commitment in that policy programme did say that the targets will be based on an overarching goal of preventing any further extinctions of wildlife and halting declines by 2030, and making significant progress in restoring Scotland's natural environment by 2045. And that date aligns with Scotland's climate net zero target. The bill is also expected to include outcome targets that accommodate species abundance, distribution and extinction risk, and habitat quality and extent. And again, this is really welcome news, as this matches the kind of 4 elements of nature targets that Scottish Environment Link and RSPB have been calling for in recent years. And finally, we welcome the commitment to an effective statutory target setting, monitoring, enforcing and reporting framework, which, given everything we've just heard from the others, is obviously going to be really crucial to the success of these targets. So I'd say that overall we have this positive commitment. I'd also say we probably have unparalleled ambition on nature at the moment, actually, from the Scottish Government. But as always with these things, that's not always trickling through to delivery. And so the detail and the delivery here are going to be key. We do have some concerns about the timescales for the bill. And so we're hoping to see a process kicking off really soon to develop the detail of what the targets will look like. And secondly, a robust delivery plan and policies for achieving these targets is obviously also crucial. So the Scottish Government have just been consulting actually on their next Scottish Biodiversity Strategy, which will run up until 2045. And unfortunately, this is one area where we feel that the substance hasn't quite matched up to the rhetoric. And despite doing a great job at setting out what that challenge looks like and where we need to get to, the strategy doesn't include clear actions or targets for how to get there and address the challenge. So we're hoping to see some key changes made when the final strategy is published later this year. Next slide, please. So just thinking quickly about some of the potential implications for Scotland of this intra-UK divergence. And I suppose I focus mostly here on the divergence in maybe mechanisms for delivering on these targets, so regulations and standards. The most obvious, as we've already touched on, is potential race to the bottom on environmental standards when we should be aiming at this race to the top. And then I guess whilst environment is a devolved matter, it is quite a complex landscape sometimes, and some Westminster regulations do apply in Scotland under some specific circumstances. And so any weakening of things like the habitats regulations at the Westminster level, which Richard's touched on already, could have direct implications for nature in Scotland. So this is something we have got concerns about and we're looking into. There's also the potential for increased complexity and uncertainty in the regulatory landscape, which can obviously pose challenges for business, local authorities and other stakeholders, and potential complexity for things like cross-border designated sites. But having said all that, I think that the defining context here in Scotland is that there's this very clear commitment to EU alignment. Next slide, please. So the Scottish Government, as I'm sure many of you are aware, has made these repeated commitments to maintain or enhance EU environmental standards. That's hugely welcome. Again, coming back to some of the points that have been made already about the need to bank and build on the important standards and targets we've already got. But I guess I'd also just like to emphasize the important point Jane made about divergence not being inherently good or bad. It's kind of the same for alignment, isn't it? So we at Link are really interested in nature positive outcomes. And so if the EU is bringing forward progressive environmental legislation, like this new potential restoration law that's being talked about, we'd like to see Scotland keep pace with that. But equally, if the EU was bringing forward regressive environmental standards, we wouldn't want to see that copied in Scots law. So the 2021 Continuity Act introduced powers for Scottish ministers to keep pace with areas of EU law where they choose to. So it's not a requirement, but it is a power. But the positive thing is that there's this additional requirement in the Act that means when exercising these powers, ministers have to have regard to an overall purpose of maintaining and advancing standards, including environmental standards. And that's a really positive direction. So I guess I'd finish off by saying that there's an opportunity here in Scotland to lead the way in progressive dynamic alignment with the EU that achieves nature positive outcomes. And as a start, we're really looking at this exciting new restoration law and hoping to see that incorporated and reflected in the nature restoration targets for Scotland when those come forward. So I'll finish there.
Thanks very much, Isabel. That was a very clear summary of where we are in Scotland. And finally, we come to Wales. We're fortunate to have Muriel Harrison, who's also representing Wales Environment Link, also works for RSPB Cymru, and the situation yet again slightly different in Wales. So look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, yes, and to reiterate what others have said, thank you to IEP for this really timely report and for the event today, and thanks for inviting us to take part. To set the scene a little in terms of the state of nature in Wales, much the same as in Scotland and Northern Ireland, unfortunately things aren't looking great. We've got 8% of species in Wales threatened with extinction from Great Britain. That was from the State of Nature report in 2019. And in terms of the condition of our protected sites in Wales, the NRW baseline evaluation of protected site features published last year for terrestrial sites showed that only 20% of features were in favourable condition, with 30% in unfavourable condition and 50% unknown at the moment. So there really is a challenge, and that's the state that we're in the absence of having binding targets in place in Wales. So if I could have the next slide, please. So the topic of targets has been rising in profile in Wales as it has in the other countries. And we had a real landmark moment in June 2021, where the Senedd declared a nature emergency with cross-party support. And as part of that declaration, called on the Welsh Government to introduce legally binding requirements to reverse biodiversity loss through statutory targets. And then following that, in December 2021, the Labour government agreed a cooperation agreement with Plaid Cymru, and that agreement said that targets have a role to play in helping to protect and restore biodiversity. But as yet, despite our climate change minister, Julie James, speaking many times of wishing to set targets and wishing to set the right targets, we still don't have a clear legislative timetable for the legislation to come forward for those targets. Next slide, please. In terms of the level of ambition that there is in Wales, we do have two key pieces of post-devolution legislation in Wales, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act and the Environment Wales Act. And these are forward-looking pieces of legislation that set out in the right direction, but they lack that formal architecture to be able to set binding targets for the environment and drive delivery towards those. More recently, last year, the Welsh Government endorsed the 30 by 30 target to protect 30% of land and sea for nature by 2030. And this year, Minister Julie James commissioned a biodiversity deep dive to provide recommendations for how that can be achieved. And that's been a big focus of activity on biodiversity in Wales over the summer months, and should be reporting in the next couple of weeks with some recommendations. But again, very, very specific to that 30 by 30 target, which is really a means target, isn't it, rather than an outcomes target. We do have proposals for a national milestone for biological diversity in Wales, which is broadly in line with nature positive ambitions, in that it talks about looking to halt and start to reverse biodiversity loss by 2030 with recovery by 2050. But this is based on an experimental indicator that is at the moment only around species distribution and covers a very limited number of species. It's in no way the same as having a legally binding target and all of the accountability that would bring. The milestones are really rather an expression of ambition. Next slide, please. Looking at divergence within the UK, lots of similarities here with what has been said about the other countries. Divergence in itself isn't necessarily good or bad, and divergence does allow for countries to set targets that are appropriate to their own natural environment, and make things bespoke in the way that they might want to. It could be a race to the top. It doesn't have to be a race to the bottom. Having said that, we do see divergence as adding significant complexity. And obviously in Wales, we've got a significant border area with England, and we have protected sites and landscape designations that straddle both Wales and England. So immediately you see the complexity that brings, and we see that playing out in situations like tackling the pollution on the River Wye. We have significant concerns over knock-on impacts for Wales of the drive that there is towards regulatory weakening from Westminster at the moment, and how that is impacting on devolution and the powers that could provide for Westminster to be reaching into Wales, and also the potential added complexity or difficulties that Divergence brings for being able to bring together those UK contributions to global targets and report those in a straightforward way. Next slide, please. Looking at divergence between the EU and Wales, we don't in Wales have the same sort of strong formal commitment as there is in Scotland in terms of keeping pace. But having said that, you know, we've had no indication that there's any interest from Welsh Government in weakening you know, what we've inherited in terms of the EU environmental standards. And indeed, the First Minister has said this summer the government is committed to upholding EU environmental standards. A major concern for us at Wales Environment Link currently is the post-Brexit environmental governance gap that we have in Wales. The other UK countries now have environmental governance bodies in place. We have the Office for Environmental Protection and we have Environmental Standards Scotland, but in Wales we have no equivalent body at the moment. And so that's a really big concern for us at the moment in terms of the rights of Welsh citizens to environmental justice. And again, the legislative timetable for addressing that remains very unclear at the moment, with the First Minister only saying that legislation will be brought forward sometime within the current Senedd term. And so a theme that we hear is that these issues are a priority for Welsh Government, but that there is such competition for legislative time that we don't get the clear commitment that we need to when these things are going to happen. Next slide, please. And this is my final slide in terms of what targets are needed to get us towards a nature positive Wales. RSPB Cymru and WWF Cymru, supported by Wales Environment Link, published a report last year putting Wales on a path to nature recovery. There's a link in the slides there that you'll have afterwards to look at that report. But that set out what we see needs to happen in terms of creating that framework for targets in Wales. So given that we're running over time, I'm not going to go through everything in that slide in detail, but it's all there in that report if you're interested. And really, yes, we're seeing the other countries in the UK, we're seeing the EU making these clear commitments and setting in place the legislative architecture and timetables to provide for targets. Yes, the targets that are being proposed are not always perfect, but there is something there to work with and to respond to. And really in Wales, we need to do the same, and we need some clear commitments and timetables if we're going to drive the action that's needed to make real change by 2030 as we need to.
Thank you, Mariel. I think you sort of underlined that the process in Wales is going a slightly different track, slightly less clear whether there'll be an inclination to follow what's happening in the EU or not, but signs of you know, positive commitment from the Senedd when the time comes. So we've got different timescales as well as different substance, and I think that is an aspect of divergence which we expected to happen. It certainly is happening, and that could be quite significant. You know, as Jane was saying, the outcomes on either side of the border in Ireland, for example, have implications. So there are going to be differences, even if by virtue of time scale, even if we end up with exactly the same target. So thanks, everybody. Now we've had some questions and we'll come to them in 1 second. I'm just first of all, though, going to give an opportunity to anybody from any of the administrations who might be on the call, just to comment if you wish to, and you know, you may want to just come back on anything that people have said today, just in case anybody wants to do that. I'm very happy to give that a bit of a priority, if that's the case. So just let me know. Doesn't look like it immediately. So I think what I'm going to do then is to go into some questions. And the first one was from Mike Clark, and that was about the Divergence project, and is that covering monitoring, implementation, data, and so forth, in terms of an issue for divergence? In other words, will the UK and its different jurisdictions be monitoring and measuring the same things or not, and so forth? Maybe not. Michael Nicholson would like to just say something about that in terms of the project. I think everybody who's spoken has indicated that is important, and the targets all depend on metrics. So metrics are not really possible to dissociate from legislation.
Thank you, David. Yes, that is something that we are beginning to look at. And I also noted a point by Stanley Johnson about the European Environment Agency, and certainly that features there too. So it is something that we are beginning to consider in this programme of activity on divergence, and we aim to be publishing something in a few months' time. So check that out when we do.
Okay, thank you. Then there's another question from Tim Graham, and this, I think, sort of really applies to all the speakers, and it's about how will COP15 influence targets, and will emerging national targets complement the emerging post-2020 framework, and is the EU complementing it? So would anybody like to respond to that, including the four speakers I just heard and Graham? Richard, you look like you might be willing to say something about that on COP15.
It's always a give and take, isn't it? So hopefully, if the government is bold in October, when it sets out its plans for targets in England, that will give Liz Truss, when she goes to Montreal, leading a delegation as she promised as part of the hustings process for the leadership competition, that will give her something to whack on the table in Montreal for COP15 to say, here's England, and hopefully there'll be similar commitments from the other countries taking a leadership role, and hopefully that will help to galvanise the big promises for the 2030 mission to halt nature's decline, and the 2050 vision for a nature positive economy, and 30 by 30. Afterwards, if that deal is struck well, then the sort of give and take continues, doesn't it? And that international framework then becomes another way to hold the government to account for its promises here. And the key, I mean, we've had this will be the third international promise to halt the decline of biodiversity, won't it? When the CBD comes to it, the key this time is that translation into national systems of law that with actions for delivery and milestones along the way that we can hold the government accountable for, so that they add up to that international effort. So the two have to work together, and we hope that things like the NBSAPs, the action plans that are required by the Convention on Biological Diversity will make requirements for clear reporting on actions at the national level needed to add up to global delivery.
And can I just add just on that point as well, that I think one of the things we hope that the COP, the CBD will do is point to the fact of the breadth of targets that are needed, because I think there's been sort of a political obsession with the 30 by 30 target, which, as Marielle said, it's a mechanism. It's not the, I suppose, that the outcome. It's about, you know, the extent and the quality, et cetera, et cetera. So from our perspective, you know, the hope is that you look at, I think currently there's 21 global targets, but I think there might be about 23, 24 at the end of it, that, you know, they cover sustainable agriculture, genetic resources, equality of indigenous nations, et cetera. You know, it's a breadth of need. And I think that's what we would really hope to see, that sort of broader recognition of this is not simply just creating habitat. This is about widespread systemic changes on how we use land and how we protect it and how we restore it.
Yeah.
Just to add from Wales, Climate Change Minister here, Julie James, has repeatedly said that she wants to set targets in Wales in the context of what's decided at COP15 in the Global Biodiversity Framework. And indeed, that's been one of the reasons that she's consistently given for not saying more about plans for targets in Wales to date. But unfortunately, given the delays that we've had in terms of COP15 actually taking place, that's pushed back further and further that horizon in Wales, meaning that we really are up against it now. And we've said all along, we don't want the ambition in Wales to be limited by doing the bare minimum that's required in terms of what comes out of COP15. Wales should be thinking for itself and setting those ambitions high. And we've known for a long time what's likely to be in that framework. We've seen the draft. So we really want to see some really swift action in Wales in terms of setting the targets and driving the underlying action that's going to be needed to make the progress by 2030.
And just to add from Scotland, it kind of interestingly, compared to what Mary was saying, we've got a slightly different situation where actually the Scottish government decided that given the kind of understandable but frustrating delays to the process, they wanted to come out on the first foot and get their biodiversity strategy, which will basically be part of their MBSAP, ready before COP15 because they don't want to keep delaying it, which we really welcomed actually, because they're kind of just trying to take a leadership role there. But then it's kind of all the more disappointing that actually when we've seen the substance of that draft strategy, it just doesn't match up to the level of action that's needed. I mean, the outcomes that are in the strategy are not smart. They need to be made much more specific and time bound. And actually, they don't necessarily all reflect some of the targets that we might see in that global biodiversity framework that will be agreed at COP15. So we're hoping that through the consultation process that's just happened, when they publish the final strategy before the end of the year, that some of those things will be resolved. But if not, we're then hoping that the next delivery plan, which will come early next year for the biodiversity strategy, will really clearly reflect some of the new targets in the CBD framework in a robust way. So that's been a slight disappointment. But on the other hand, the Scottish government have led something called the Edinburgh Declaration, which is setting out the kind of role of subnational governments in delivering the CBD targets. And that's been a really great process. So a bit of a mixed bag from Scotland, I'd say, on that front.
Thanks, everybody. Graham, do you want to say anything on the EU on that? You don't need to, but you want to.
Well, just very briefly, that the EU, the die is already cast. It has its biodiversity strategy to 2030. It's second guessed the 30 by 30 protected area target, which looks likely to happen, which was some people were not very happy with the EU going ahead on that basis, but anyway, that's the situation. Of course, the outcome of the CBD could affect the negotiating positions of some of the member states with regard to the restoration law, and it could affect the implementation of the biodiversity strategy to some extent. But beyond that, the die is cast.
Well, thanks, everybody. That's interesting. Different perspectives on that. Now, it's kind of different question now from Louise Guillot about, do divergences identified sort of so far in this discussion amount to regression of EU environment laws and the meaning of the EU-UK TCA, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement? I don't think we need to have a big discussion about this because we're talking about proposals here, for one thing. No one's actually adopted these targets, and they're not regressive in the sense that the TCA is concerned with the baseline of standards. So we shall see. If we end up with measures that are in fact regressive, then that would be a different matter. But insofar as we're talking about targets for the future, I think that's not the case. Some people have argued that biodiversity is not something which affects the level playing field, which has been the kind of core concern behind those provisions in the TCA. But I don't think that's correct, in the sense that actually there are competitiveness impacts from biodiversity, and we've seen those for example, in relation to the way that ports have been regulated, dredging and so forth. There is competition between ports, and there's quite a lot of sensitivity about the market share of different ports and so forth. So I think there's nothing in principle to say that biodiversity is outside the whole frame of the level playing field of the TCA at all, but I'm not sure there were, with that point in this particular thing. So I'm going to move on to the next question. Stanley Johnson saying, should we consider rejoining the European Environment Agency? Well, yeah, that's a political question, and certainly interesting at the moment that the data sets which underlie quite a lot of EU policy draw quite a lot on UK evidence, as I think Graham said already. So it is a bit of a pity that we haven't got full cooperation between the UK and the EEA, just in terms of the quality of environmental decision making, the coherence of the data sets and so forth. So we shall see if the government has second thoughts about that. And then there's a question from Alan Buckwell about, is the OEP scrutinizing the emerging EU-UK targets yet? I don't know if there's anyone here from the OEP, if they want to comment on that. That would be something that they've got the discretion to do and give advice if they wish to on emerging legislation, at least in England and Northern Ireland. But do signal if anyone from the OEP wants to comment on that. Otherwise, there's a question here from Pip Goodwin. What's the timeline for the EU's restoration law regulation? This is to Graham. Timeline, and do you have a sense of whether there's likely to be significant opposition to it, and if so, from which quarters? Give us a bit of an overview, Graham. What's going to happen to this proposal? It's quite an early stage in the process, isn't it?
Yes. Well, the timetable, I think, is very vaguely considered to be over the next couple of years before there is a clear outcome. And what was the second part of the question? Oh, yeah, well, whether there would be much opposition. Well, there's already been a lot of consultation during the preparation of the proposal. There's been a very detailed impact assessment carried out, which has gathered evidence, etc. So there's already been quite a lot of discussion. There's obviously been a lot of discussion behind the scenes in the Commission. So the Commission should have taken into account those views to some extent, and we have seen some changes in the proposals as they were being developed over the last year or two, which have reflected probably the views, particularly in terms of land use and agricultural interests. So those views, I think, have already, been taken into account to some extent. I don't know, and I probably don't think anyone else knows quite what will happen next in terms of, whether those views were considered to be sufficient by those interest groups. But no doubt there will be a lot of continuing lobbying. And there may well be significant changes to the proposals. But I think the overall ambition of the proposals is pretty clear and likely to stay, even if the details change.
Thanks, Graham. I think there will be issues around the affordability of the restoration targets and whether there's going to be money on the table, either from existing EU funds or from some other funds. So I think that'll be an interesting aspect of the position adopted in some member states. We shall see. I think Tim Graham had his hand up. Tim, was that one of these points you wanted to come back on?
Hi, I don't know whether this is working or not because I can't seem to turn on my camera. But just in terms of, I did try and answer in the chat about the OEP and being interested in divergence and things. So terms of targets and in our response, it might not have been as detailed as we looked into it in the background, but we were obviously interested in the commitments that had been made in the past to not to no divergence or to improve standards, etc. And then I just put a message that one of the key areas that we have been exploring in more detail is around environmental assessments as just one huge broad set of EU directives and regulations that are obviously undergoing huge pressure at the moment. So that's where the attention's been.
And if I could just add to that point, sorry, I think also in terms of the target and the focus, it points to the divergence of the mechanisms underpinning the targets, because whereas in England there's the sort of the legal obligations on the targets, and okay, whilst interim targets aren't legally binding, those longer term set targets for biodiversity, water quality, waste are legally binding. For Northern Ireland they're not. So again, there's a divergence in the mechanisms that underpin the targets, and then obviously then the enforcement and the oversight capacity of the UEP, and that's only between England and Northern Ireland, of course. So it's another sort of, I suppose, pathway of divergence that we're also seeing.
That's a good point. And thanks, Tim, for that clarification. We've got another question here from Tess Cully at ENDS, and it actually touches on something a couple of other people have brought up around the Emerald Network. And the question is, how might conventions like the Bern and Aarhus Convention impact on Westminster attempts to diverge from the EU? So these are international agreements that the UK is party to, for example, Council of Europe agreements, rather than EU agreements. And so there's a question here, will those agreements affect any decisions in the UK and impact on any proposals diverge from the EU? I don't know if anyone would like to comment on that. It's a kind of different topic than targets, really. Go on, Richard.
Well, it might be worth just saying that although many of the things in Bern look very similar to the equivalents under the birds and habitats directives in terms of requirements for site protection and aspirations for their condition, and many of those sites have been notified under the Emerald Network. The problem is always enforceability, isn't it? And unless you have domestic rules that, to bring it back to targets, set that goal of achieving good status, favorable condition, whatever it might be, then the chances of a compliance mechanism kicking in with enough force to make a difference feel low. And the same is proven true with Aarhus, where I think we've been struggling to demonstrate access to environmental justice for some time.
No, thanks, Richard. And it looks like Jane's agreeing with you on that. And certainly there are no enforcement arrangements under Council of Europe agreements, which is one reason that the Habitats Directive was put forward as a measure which covers rather similar ground in some ways inside the EU. Stanley Johnson's got his hand up. Stanley, is it on this point? I think it might be. Do you want, Stanley, have you got a quick word here? You're muted.
Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Well, no, I'm simply making it a point, and I did make it in a letter, in a quote I gave to the Times yesterday, which is on the Times website, is that the government may blithely think it can scrap the habitats regulations in the UK under the powers it's taken under the Environment Act, but it is certainly bound by the fact that these sites were notified last December, all of them, and it amounts to about 9% of the area covered in the UK, notified to the Council of Europe. They are officially part of the Emerald Network. And if you look at my remarks in the chat, I've given you the official document where you can track it down, and you see all the individual sites. So yes, of course, Victor's point about enforcement is a very good one. What the government would not be free to do would be to delist all those sites, or even to a full proportion of them, without doing so officially as far as the Council of Europe is concerned. And if it doesn't want to have the Council of Europe involved in this, then it'll have to decide what it feels about the Berne Convention. So I just think we ought to say in a fairly aggressive way to the government, their hands are tied, and they ought jolly well to realize it, and of course, because they're so illiterate, they know this, and this is pointed out in very good terms. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Stanley. It's certainly true that, yeah, we do have international obligations and not just EU obligations. And yeah, that's a point worth bearing in mind very much. I think we're coming to an end now, so I think I'm going to wrap up. And first of all, just thank all the speakers. First of all, for what they said today, and for coming and being very clear and pretty brief, all things considered, and for the help they gave Graham. And thank you to Graham for, under fairly short time pressure, putting together quite a tricky synopsis of rather diverse approaches, as we just heard. And thanks everybody for coming. We've had a nice diverse audience here, and for contributing your thoughts as well. We will make the slides available, as I said before, and we will, yes, have other webinars in this series, not necessarily looking at exactly the same thing, but different aspects of divergence. So do stay in touch if you're interested in this whole topic, and we'd like to make sure that information is shared. It's quite difficult to track exactly what's going on and to understand it. One has to kind of dig quite deep sometimes. So with that, and thanks to the team who put this together inside IEP, thanks very much. And I hope we'll see many of you again in different formations in future. And we'll close there. Thank you.